Hi, Emma. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me. And thank you so much for, joining book club with our very first Who to Judge book club book of the month pick. This is so exciting. And it's such an honor, really. Your work is incredible. And I've quickly become a big fan. So I'm so excited to talk to you about the book and you as an author and a person.
Oh, thanks, Anneliese. And, it feels like a mutual appreciation society because I'm a big fan of yours as well. It's lovely. I'm so honored that you've chosen the book for your book club.
Can you share a little bit about yourself? Just tell us about you.
I'm Australian, as you can tell, I'm sure from the accent. And Pictures of You is my sixth book, but it's my second adult novel. I wrote a book called The Last Love Note, which was published by Zebby Books a year ago. And I was very lucky in the US because it was picked up by the Book of the Month Club and by the Target Book Club. So it was a lovely introduction to the American audience. And then I was very privileged to go on a book tour about a year ago and meet a lot of the readers who I've kept in touch with. I think that's the brilliant thing about Instagram, that we can make connections at book events. And a year later, I'm still talking to a lot of the people I met. And then Pictures of You is my latest book, which came out in November and amazingly became a USA Today bestseller. This is a book that's been a long time coming. It's I like to write romantic storylines because I'm sort of influenced by Anne of Green Gables, I think, back when I was 14 and started writing. She's sort of responsible for this whole career, actually, which I can talk about a little bit later. But I have been surrounded by relationships my whole life, ever since I was a teenager. Our friends started getting their first boyfriends and would run into this problem of controlling, possessive boyfriends. And that's what we used to call them back in the 1980s. Because we didn't know we wouldn't have language like coercive control and love bombing and gaslighting and all those terms we're very familiar with now. And this has been a pattern of the people, the friends and family around me all through every decade of my life, and I'm now 51, that women are winding up in these kinds of relationships. And so my first novel, The Last Love Note, was about grief and loss, and this one is very much about control and about how we can find ourselves in a situation we never imagined that we'd be in, and then how we can move through it and out of it.
I first want to say that, congratulations on all the success of this book. It is so well deserved. It's incredible. Like you said, a USA Today bestseller, book of the month selection, also People Magazine's best book of 2024, November 2024. That is so fantastic. And I have The Last Love Note in my Libby. I just started it. So excited reading that as well. And the themes that you explore, you have the heavy, but you also have so much hope within that. And it's interesting because, you talk about this topic of coercive control in Pictures of You, and I had never heard that term before, but love bombing is what it reminded me of. You dedicated the book to your daughter in criminology, getting her PhD. And so I guess what was that research like to include that here?
Yes. So Hannah, who's actually coming with me on my upcoming book tour, so you may meet her at the event at Zibby's
Yeah.
bookshop. She's 26 and she is studying criminology. She's finishing her PhD hopefully this year, and she's been looking at gendered violence against women. And I still remember the conversation I had with her in a bookshop. We were actually at somebody else's event about a year ago when I'd started writing this novel. And we just have these moments of inspiration, I think. And we were talking about the characters and what will have happened. At this point, I knew that Evie had lost her memory and had amnesia. And I didn't know, I knew that something had happened to her, but didn't know what because I don't plot my books. So it's just all a process of hectic discovery. And Hannah and I just got talking, and it fell into place that this is what will have happened to her, that she will have been in a relationship where she has lost herself piece by piece because her first boyfriend, who then became her husband, has taken this from her in one of those relationships. And so having a daughter on hand who is an academic expert in this area was really helpful to write a book. But I felt a great sense of responsibility to get this story right and to be careful that I didn't victim blame or anything like that. So I also spoke to a woman called Kat Burney, who is the executive director of the National Women's Safety Alliance in Australia. And she read this book about, I don't know, 8 drafts. It was incredible. She gave me so much support and advice. And she also is a survivor of this kind of abuse. And then I spoke to a whole lot of people who've been through this as well. I have been in the supporting role with friends over the years, trying to help people see what's going on. And I think that's one of the main challenges, that when you're in the relationship, it can be difficult to see what's happening and to find your way through. So it was one that I did need to do a lot of research on and to be really careful with. I think it's such a responsibility to be gentle with subject matter like this, to write it in such a way that also brings in the hope. And I wanted to position this toxic relationship beside a very beautiful and healthy one. And that's where the hope comes in. And I also wanted to ensure that these two men in the book have both come from traumatic backgrounds in a different way, and yet only one of them has chosen to go down this path of how he's treating her, and the other one isn't. And I think that came because I am a mum of 3 kids. I've got my 2 daughters who are in their 20s, and then I've got a son who's 14. And really, I think I wrote a lot of this book as a mother, thinking for the girls, this is, this is what to look out for. This is who to strive to meet. And also for my son about, I don't know if he's going to read it, but but we've talked a lot about it, about behavior again, how to treat women.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's very clear that you took so much care and so much respect in terms of the subject matter. And I think that you balanced that so well. And so it's so interesting to hear about the research that you did. You talked about the amnesia. How did that come about? I think there's so many moments where, Evie's feeling all these things and she's thinking that that's from the amnesia, but it's really, like you had said, the separation from herself in this toxic relationship.
Think that really helped to ramp up that feeling of being completely lost in your own life, which is a feeling that a lot of us have at different times without amnesia. And I know that I definitely know how that feels. My other book, The Last Love Note, was written after the death of my husband. And so at 42, I became a young widow with three kids. And I remember thinking, I now have to rewrite my entire future. I don't, I just felt completely upended. The rug had just been ripped from underneath us. And so there's that kind of feeling that she has in this book for a different reason. And I think we can probably all identify or will identify in the future with feeling that way at some point in time. And because I don't plot the book, it was quite hair-raising to write, because not only did my character my character didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what was going on either. And so you kind of are just hoping that somewhere in your subconscious mind, all of this is going to come together in the end. And and there you reach this point. I think it's sort of about, I don't know, 80% of the way through writing a book, when you're not plotting it, where you can suddenly see where it's going and how it's going to all be pulled together. And it's such a relief when that happens. But I think the the device of amnesia really helped to ramp up the intrigue, and for her to have arrived in a life. And so at the beginning, when she's at the funeral, it's not a spoiler, I don't think, to say that she's at the funeral of her husband and she's looking around her and she's watching herself on the screen, in the slideshow of images that you'd see at a funeral. And she's not recognizing any of this, but she's also not liking much of it. And she's looking around thinking, I don't like the people I'm with. And also, where are my family? Where are my friends? And she's been isolated by him, which is exactly what happens in these relationships. And so for her to then try to piece all of this back together and find out how she ended up in this life that she'd never anticipated, having been a very driven and academic and big dreaming young woman, she's just really disappointed and confused about where she's ended up. And then the only person who can really help her to piece everything back together is her childhood, teenage best friend, Drew, who she also can't remember and has to learn to trust. And I think there's something in him and his way of treating her all along that brings out that trust, even though really to her he is a stranger for most of the book.
Were there any, you said you don't plot your books, which I think is fantastic and really interesting. Were there any moments that you were surprised by the way a character reacted to a certain situation?
Yes, every moment really. I felt the only way I can describe it is it's sort of like you're at a movie, watching a movie play out on the screen in front of you, and just desperately trying to jot down the action as it unfolds, and you'll be hearing the characters speak to each other as if it's coming from somewhere else. It's not, you're not sitting there thinking, what will they say next? It doesn't happen like that. It's more just this desperate sort of attempt to catch up with the action that's coming from somewhere else. It's quite amazing how it happens. I think you just got to sort of let go and let your subconscious mind take over. But I know with so for example, in my previous book, I did something early on in the book where I said that there was a secret between her husband and her new love interest. And that was sort of early on in the book. And I had no idea what that secret was when I said that. And I didn't work it out until just before she did, towards the end of the book. And so there are a lot of things like that in Pictures of You as well, where there's a whole lot of twists that unfold. A lot of them I hadn't predicted. I hadn't sat there and planned it. And I know that some writers do, and they'll have a really detailed plan. I have a friend, Ben Stevenson, who's, I say friend, I met him at a festival. He's an Australian writer, but I watched him speak, and he writes detective fiction. He's a bestseller in the US as well, and he does a 10,000 word planning document where he outlines absolutely everything, and then he's got that, and he sits down and writes the book. And I just wish I was that sort of writer because it would be easier, I think. Well, I don't know if it's easier, but it would just give me a bit of comfort that something's going to be okay. This feels more hair-raising to do it this way, but there are a lot of times when I sort of wrote something and then just sat back and thought, wow, I didn't see that coming. And I think it's kind of a thrilling edge of your seat kind of way to write a book.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I can only imagine. There was a lot of moments of realization for Evie, about her life as it is now. Like you said, she was very isolated and didn't like a lot of the life that she was seeing. And then in starting to piece it together, the reaction from her parents when she showed up at their doorstep, seeing her best friend again for the first time, which she finds out is a long time. What went into writing those moments of realization? Then can you maybe walk me through a little bit of, how the movie played out?
I think I think you have to fall in love with your characters. And so while you're writing, you really become that character in your head, which is, I guess, similar to acting, that you step into a character and you have to sort of believe that you are that person. And that's when you really pull it off. And I think writing's not so much, not so different. I have to become inside Evie's head and be imagining what would it feel like if I turned up on my parents' doorstep and they didn't want to see me. I mean, what could have happened to get to the point where, a parents would give up on me like that? I'm saying me, but because I'm thinking in her head. And
Yeah.
so I think that the emotion that you can bring out as a writer comes from really being able to become very close to these people and to think of them as people, not as characters.
Mhm.
It was very easy for me to do that in my previous book because the topic was so similar to my own life, except for the bit where she fell in love again, which hasn't yet happened, but that's kind of aspirational. But but it was very easy for me to imagine how that might feel. And what I loved doing is writing in Pictures of You, writing the dual narration with Drew as well and his perspective. It's really nice to have the opportunity to get into the head of somebody else who you aren't ever going to be. So for me to get into the head of this man and imagine this friendship evolving between the two of them and what he has sacrificed and the risks that he's taking to now help this woman who has also abandoned him in the past.
Mhm.
And I think he's just, an incredibly strong person. And so I don't know. I think that's how it's done. I think it's just to connect really closely with the people that you're writing about. And it's sort of interesting because I've got my new book due to the publisher in 5 days. So I'm now so much in the head of those characters that when I come to talk about pictures of you or the last love note, I'm thinking, hang on, what happened in that story, and who are we talking about today? And you just become so enmeshed in their stories that they're in your mind when you're driving around, when you're going to the supermarket, you're sitting at events at the school, you're watching things, but at the same time, you're just living in another world while you're writing a book.
It's so interesting to me how similar it is to acting, stepping into that character. That makes so much sense to me. Also, with those scenes, I was thinking that it really highlighted the subtlety of coercive control. You talked a bit about the research that you and Hannah did and, the conversations you had, but how did you go about, really showing that and unraveling that?
Yeah, I think the word subtlety is exactly the right one. And with this type of violence, it is often so subtle that people don't realize it's happening until they're so well entrenched in it. Because it's mind games, it's subtle manipulation. And I think that the way that I was able to demonstrate that over a period of time was that the book covered a 13-year period from when she was 16 to 29. So we were able to dip into her life at various times in these sort of flashback scenes and see her at school. And then you see her again, just after she's finished school when she's 19. And you can see that she's a little bit less of who she was at 19 from when you last saw her. And then we see her a couple of years later, and again, that period of time has meant that the relationship has carved off more pieces. And I think doing it that way over that period of time helped me to create that sense of subtlety, because it is not a type of violence where you often would see outward bruises. It's something that happens internally, even though the statistics are quite horrifying. And in 98% of intimate partner homicide, coercive control was present first. But it's often that violence of killing their partner is often the first time it's erupted into physical violence, but this has been present all this time. So I really wanted to capture that in a way that helped the reader also notice that I mean, we can see what's happening to her, but it's still subtle to us as well. I need the reader sort of fall in love at first, with the person who came to become, her abuser. And we had been at the same time last year, a lot of people reading and then watching the movie If It Ends With Us. And I think I was watching all of that play out, and of course, still playing out. And one of the things was about whether the trap is that you're going to romanticize the abusive storyline. And I think that was just in my head the whole time, that it was really important to not ever romanticize the toxic relationship. And I think by having this other beautiful friendship and relationship beside it, it helped me to sort of, delineate between those two types of relationships. And so I'm very grateful to Drew for being there, and so I can hold him up as an example of this is how we can do it. And he is a wonderful man.
My thoughts are all over the place. Oh my gosh, there's so much I have to ask you. I think there's a fine line, like I think you've mentioned before, between passion and obsession, and I think you mastered that. And that delicate balance was so clear as the story unfolded, especially with Drew's relationship as a contrast. But the last love note, you mentioned the theme of loss, and I felt like as a reader, I really felt that with pictures of you. The loss of self, the loss of relationships. The loss of the identity, from the coercive control and that toxic relationship. But then, as she was getting her memory back, you used photography and pictures as a motif to kind of piece it all back together and bring her back to, who she was when Drew was photographing her all those years ago. What went into that decision to use that as such a tool?
Photography is a passion that I discovered after my husband died. It's the one thing, apart from these books, that I wish I could show him, because he didn't know me as a photographer. and it's something that I absolutely adore. And so that's where that came from. It was the, the love that I have. I also feel like the book is a bit of a love letter to the Australian coastline. There are some beautiful beaches in Australia, and a lot of the scenes with the photography are set on beaches. And I just feel like the Australian beaches are almost another character in the story. And so I think when she has been in such a traumatic and awful situation, um, she needs to fall back in love with the world. And for me, I know that I did that through photography. I remember going for a walk with my friend Sally, who took me out 6 weeks after my husband died. We went for a beautiful walk. There was blossom trees. There was a lake with, shining water. And I remember looking at it and thinking, I can see that is intellectually, I can tell that is a beautiful scene in front of me, but I'm not feeling anything in my heart. And I just felt numb. And I made that decision that day that I would continue to turn up and look at the world until my heart caught up again with my eyes and what they were seeing. And to have gone from feeling that way to being fully embraced in photography, where I'll lie on the ground for 2 hours in the middle of winter taking photos of tiny little dewdrops on blades of grass and all sorts of things. That was a real experience of growth in my own life. So I wanted to give this to Evie as something, and I think too, because you can capture um, photos of a person over a period of time that also tell a story. And she was able to see through the photos that Drew had been taking of her all those years, um, just the disintegration in how she looked. And the light goes out in your eyes and you can see that. And so it was a beautiful device to be able to use to shine a light on all sorts of different things in the book. And just something I'm actually really excited because I'm doing an event in LA at a photographic gallery, which will be amazing. So yeah, it's lovely. I think it was sort of my pandemic hobby that I picked up, and it's really stuck.
That's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Oh my gosh. That was lovely to learn. And I'm so excited for that event at the gallery as well. I'm excited to talk about the events and everything you have coming up. How did you realize your love for writing?
Well, that's where Anne of Green Gables comes in. I remember sitting down one Christmas holidays here in Australia, which was hot weather, and so we were all lying around watching TV. And two of my aunts and my mum introduced my sister and I to the 1985 Kevin Sullivan version of Anne of Green Gables. And my grandmother called her house Avonlea. So this is a very strong family love. And I remember watching it with my sister, and we both fell in love with Gilbert, obviously, immediately. But then I fell in love with Anne as a writer. And I remember thinking, just identifying with her as a 14-year-old, looking at the fact that she had such a burning desire to get stories on the page and to be published. And I walked to the local newsagent the next day, and because this is way before we had laptop computers or anything, or any computers at home. And I bought a notebook and pen, and I thought, I'm going to write a novel. And I started writing it. I've still got bits and pieces from that here, and I would never show them to anyone. It's just terrible. But it was this joy that I found in carrying a story around and just thinking about these characters. And I remember my sister looking at me and saying, why are you spending your summer holidays doing homework? And I thought, this doesn't feel like homework. This feels like an incredible experience. Like, it's just so much fun. I don't know what I was doing before I found this. It was this real passion. And so I've always had that from that moment on. Um, and I think that was the day I realized that that's what a writer is. You don't have to be published. You don't even have to finish writing a book. It's more the stories that you carry around in your heads, because not everyone is doing that. And I think that's the difference. And so she helped me to see that, really, by saying she has absolutely no interest in doing what I was doing. And she's also my biggest supporter now, decades on.
That's so sweet. What's your
Yeah.
favorite book right now?
There's a couple of books that are coming out in the US that are from Australian authors, actually, that I've been reading. I've read sort of recently. One is Jane Tara's book, Tilda is Visible, which is really magical realism about a midlife woman who suddenly starts to become invisible, which is something a lot of middle-aged women are well versed in. But this is an actual disease that she has. So she's literally becoming invisible, but it's a metaphor for that. That's a really interesting story. And I've also been loving The Borrowed Life of Frederick Fife, which is written by Anna Johnston, who's another Australian author. And then Karen Main, who is a good friend here, who's written Lenny Marks Gets Away with Murder, which is already out in the US, and she has her new book coming out this year as well. So I always love to talk about other Australian authors. It's such a big deal for us to be published in the US at all. So very grateful.
I have heard from other authors that they don't really read while they're writing another book, which you've mentioned. So,
Well, that's it. I mean, that's actually that's true. I do sometimes, if I'm writing a book, it's hard. I find it hard to read at the same time, only because when you read a good book, it makes you want to write. It just sort of makes me want to scurry off and start writing my own book. So it's hard to sometimes stay. And it's a compliment to the author because they have inspired me to feel that urge to write. And I think there's also sometimes just a fear that we will be influenced by what we're reading. So sometimes I think when you get into your own story, you don't want to pick up anything else. You want to just stay in your own lane. But yeah, it's been, and the other thing is that since I lost my husband, I have, and this is really common with people who are going through grief and loss, is that it can be hard to read and just hard to focus and concentrate. I actually found it easier to write than read during those years. And I really, what got me through that was audiobooks. And I find that I choose audiobooks now over print books most of the time. It's just, I think it's partly the fact that you can be doing it while you're doing other things, driving and exercising and cleaning your house and whatever. So audiobooks have been amazing. And I've developed such great relationships with the audio narrators of these books. So it's been really such a privilege to be talking to them on Instagram and, having chats about the characters and because they're acting as well. It's very much a performance when they read a book.
I feel like I understand that as a creative, that experience of reading books. I love audiobooks. Asking you about your book, Start at the End, which I believe is releasing in 2026. Is there anything you can share about that? I'm so excited for it.
I'm so excited too. And I think you saw on Instagram, I set myself this absolutely, I don't know what I was thinking, a goal to have the first draft finished by midnight 2024, like, midnight New Year's Eve. And I got there within minutes to spare, which meant that I'd had to write 10,000 words in the last 2 days of the year, which I don't recommend. I don't think I'll ever
Oh my
do that.
gosh.
But it is a story where I'm really asking the question, who controls the narrative in a relationship? And it's another one that has, I mean, it's hard to talk about this one without spoilers, but, ever since Jeff died, I have always wondered what would have happened if this was the other way around and if I'd been the one to have died and what would have happened to the family and where would they be living? Would he have repartnered? All those sorts of questions. So I'm kind of playing with that theme in this new book and it's been really quite fascinating to think about. And I'm just really excited to be handing the first draft in because I know that in my case, what I tend to do is the first draft, I'm just sort of telling myself the story and then I give it to the editors and then really the hard work begins after that. I did 15 drafts of pictures of you in the end. And I think the biggest jump between drafts was between the first and second draft. And it was almost a rewrite in some ways. And with the last love note too, it was, I actually had COVID when I was handing that in and I was delirious and I decided to restructure it the night before it was due and I picked up massive parts of it and moved them and all of this. And my agent was having conniptions looking at me because I posted that on Facebook, and she sort of thought, what am I doing? But anyway, it was the feverish nature of it. It seemed to work.
Oh my
Uh,
gosh.
but yeah, it'd be lovely to just write a draft of a book and that was it. But it's just such a long haul.
How long did it take you to write pictures of you between those drafts? What
It
was the
was,
timing
yeah,
like?
it was probably, I mean, it was within a year, but that year was really hectic because I was doing a lot of promotional events and touring here and in the States for the last Love
Mhm.
Note. And also the nature of that book, it led to a lot of private messages from readers. So I was constantly answering really deep messages from readers about their own losses. And so there was a lot going on. And then I lost my own mum while I was in the middle of writing Pictures of You, which you can see, well, I think you can see that in the book. That comes out in the book, and that's just sort of what you do as an author. You take experiences that have happened in your life, and it helps you to process those by putting them into writing. And so there is a bit of mum in this book, and I think I feel very grateful to my publishers who were all just so incredibly understanding and gave me extensions and all of that, while I was writing it, because life happens around what we're doing and in any job. And I'm just very grateful to them for their support. But this time, I think it's taken me 6 months or something to write this first draft, and it's not coming out till March 2026. But I think the next draft's due in April, something like that. So you can get an idea of the schedule. It feels tight at the time, and it's hard because you're in the mindset of writing, which is very solitary and very, you're in your pajamas half the time, and then you've got to turn on your promotional side, which doesn't come naturally to a lot of authors, and a lot of us are quite introverted. Well, I'm introverted. And so then getting up and speaking in front of people or doing media interviews, it feels like such a whiplash kind of situation. But, it's all part of the job. So it's like the seasons of a book.
First, I'm so sorry for your losses, and I'm astounded that you took only a year to write this book. I mean, I think it's so layered and so beautiful, and like I I guess astounded. I don't know if that's the right word. I'm thinking of the definition and it's not coming to mind, so I hope that it is. But I'm just impressed, I think is what I'm trying to say. I think that's incredible. And yeah, I love hearing about everything that you poured into this book. And I'm so excited. I think 6 months is also incredible for your next book. I think that's
Well, that's just the first draft.
amazing.
Like, don't get, it's messy at this point. But it's then that you get the input from editors that really helps you to lift it. And I think that's the thing. My top writing advice to people comes from my agent, Anne Jeanette, who says to me all the time, just race to the end of the messy first draft, and then you've got something to work with. And that advice has seen me through a lot, because you do question yourself as you're writing and
Mhm.
say, can I do this? It's very hard to sit down and start the first page of a new book if your last book has done really well and been accepted beautifully by readers, because there's this enormous pressure as you're writing, people saying, can't wait for your next book. And you're thinking, but look
Mm.
at it, it's a mess, And so you've got to really get your mindset straight and remember not to compare the bit that you're writing now with the final product that's gone through all that editing of the last one. And to remember that that was also a first draft and messy at the start.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice. And it's something I'll be thinking about as well. Were there any really big changes from that first draft of Pictures of You to where it is now?
I mean, the reality is that I ended up, I think the first draft was 70,000 words. It eventually got up to about 112, which was too long. So then we had to cut it back. It's around
Mm.
98 or something now. I have, I think, another document here somewhere that's got 40,000 words that I cut out of the book. And that's the case with the other one as well. And so I then rewrote a huge chunk. And there was a lot of um, thinking about the structure in this one, because we had two timelines and two narrators,
Mhm.
and one of them had amnesia. So that was really complex. And I do remember going to a writing workshop once, and they said, just don't do two dual timelines, don't do dual narrators, too hard. And I've
Mm.
done all of it in one book. But I so there was a lot of change and some storylines where it got a little bit too unbelievable. So I'd have to cut that, bring that back. And I think the other thing that I was doing was balancing the input from two different editors, because it was published by Penguin in Australia and by Zibby Owens in the US. And so I was working all the time with two editors. And in this one that I'm doing now, I'm working with three because it's also being published in the UK. And um, thankfully, these three editors I'm about to work with are going to work together first and then send me one document, because we realized last time, and it was a beautiful collaborative experience, but we still had sort of thoughts coming from two directions. And so that was a lot to process. And both of them were very much of the opinion that it was still my book and I needed to make the final decision. And there are times when you just want someone to say, just do it this way. And but they don't do that. So yes, there's a huge amount of change, and that's one of the lessons I've learned for this book I'm writing now, is that rather than go back and tinker around with what I've already written in the early parts of the book, I've learned that really I need the editors to get involved first, because we might cut big sections out of this book, and I don't want to have spent so much time working on it and perfecting it and tinkering around with it till I know that it's definitely going to stay in the book. So it's interesting that with each book you learn new lessons and try and streamline the process a bit.
What would you say is your favorite part of your writing process?
I love the rush of a new draft. I love
Mm.
jumping into a story and creating it as you're going through. Even though that is also a bit scary because, as I've said, not plotting it, you don't know if it's going to work. I have in the previous times got sort of 30,000 words into a book and thought this is not working and discarded it. So it can be hair raising. But I also love um, that just seeing it lift between the first and second drafts. And I'm glad that I know that that's where the best writing's going to be, so that I can hand in a book and say, here it is, just the first sort of brush of the story. I can't wait to really do the work in the next draft. And I think there's some comfort that you already have something on the page, a full story, and that now it's a matter of how can I deepen the themes, deepen the interactions between the characters, bring out the personalities more, add in more humor. It sort of feels like a layering experience. And then that's all about the story itself and the characters and the plot. And then there's the writing, which I think is an entirely separate thing, the actual words and how you use language. And I've got synesthesia, which you may have heard of, which is where you associate colors with syllables and letters and
Mm.
words. And I will sometimes sit there and look at a sentence and think there are not enough different colors in this sentence. And I'll go through and change words that mean the same thing, that just sound more musical. And so there's this entire process a bit later on where it's really just looking at every single sentence. I'll read sentences aloud and make sure that that the rhythm of the sentence is musical. And I love that part. It's so much fun.
Do you see the colors and you just know that you can visualize them, or do you have to like take the highlighters and to see that there's not enough of something?
No, it's just sort of in your mind's eye. It's
Wow.
not, so I'm looking at the words and they're just sort of black text on a white page, but in my head, they've got a color associated with them. And it's always
That's
the same color.
fascinating.
But yeah, it is
That's
really
so cool. Oh my gosh, I don't think I've ever heard of that before.
of people who have more elaborate forms of synesthesia, like they can taste words and taste
Mm.
other items, shapes, and all sorts of things. So it's really interesting once you look into it. I'm thinking of bringing that into my next book, actually, the one after this, because
Yeah,
it's such an interesting way that our minds work.
I want to look into that more just because it's so interesting. I know writing can be very solitary, but you post on Instagram quite a bit. I saw the 20,000 and 40,000 words and post those challenges for yourselves, and you post those goals and how you meet them. And where else can we keep up with you?
It's a bit of accountability, isn't it? So on Instagram and Facebook, I'm at Emma Gray Author, Gray with an EY. You can also keep up with me on Zibby Owen's website, zibbymedia.com. And I love to get messages from readers. So feel free to send me a message. I'd love to chat.
And then you also had mentioned earlier there are two events coming up with Zibby. One, the gallery walk on the 27th, I believe at 11 a.m. More information found on Zibby's website. But then also there's a Q&A that you have on the 27th at 6.
Zibby's bookshop in Santa Monica. And that's the start of a tour. I think I'm doing 8 states in the US
Wow.
in 13 days or something. It's going to be hectic, but
Oh my
fun. So I think all the information will be on her website, and I'll share it very shortly on Instagram as well. And I'd so love to meet people at these events. It's just so different to get into a room with readers and to have gone from that, sitting in pajamas at home writing to actually holding the book in your hand and talking to readers about it. It's just magical.
I love that. And thank you so much for everything that you've shared today about the book and about yourself. I think it was so kind of you and very generous to share what you have. And is there anything that I didn't ask that you would like book club to know that I can
Well,
really.
no, just that as you've got everyone reading the book, I'd love to engage with your readers and to have a conversation about this, about anything to do with writing. As you can see, I don't mind talking about private stuff that has influenced the books that I'm writing as well. I think that there's something incredible about books that makes us feel as though we're not the only one. And that when you're writing about these kinds of topics, sometimes it's fiction that really helps people to see themselves and to see a path through whatever it is that they're going through. I did have a beautiful anecdote that was from one of my readers of The Last Love Note who had lost her husband only weeks before she read my book. And she said she'd been carrying it around in her handbag ever since because it felt like the only person in the world who understood how she felt. And
Mm.
so that is what I'm really aiming for as a writer. And I hope that this book will have, that this has had the same effect with readers. And I just would love to have conversations with them.
That's so amazing. And thank you again for your time. And I really appreciate this. And I'm excited for all the discussions that we can have based on everything we've just talked about and more.
Yes, I can't wait to meet you.
Oh my gosh, I can't wait to meet you. I'm so
I know.
excited. I will also be there. And I'm like running through my mind. I'm like, okay, how quickly can I get to 8 different states in 13 days? Just be on my
Yeah.
way, see all of them. No, but that is so fantastic. And thank you again.